Hello and welcome to the CFB Super Show. I am your host, Walter Waddell, aka Dub Deuces 85, and I am joined for Conference Championship Week by my friend, partner, and huge college football aficionado, Jake Kuchek. We are, of course, on the FTN Network. If you're watching live or even on demand, please make sure you hit that like button. Show us some love by commenting on the video as well, interacting with us, sharing it across your socials. We definitely appreciate it. It is absolutely wild how fast this season has gone. It is your last chance to get the promotion going on. If you use the code NIGHTHOOPS, get yourself 50% off, discount your first month subscription. Any plan on FTN Daily, certainly don't want to let that go by. Get yourself access to NBA, NFL, NHL, and all of the other offerings, especially college basketball. And why wouldn't you want to? It's been a great start to the season. We're wrapping things up here with college football, but there's still a lot of opportunity to make some money, build your bankrolls, and have a little bit of fun. We do have two slates that we're going to talk about here tonight. The 2-game slate, which is tomorrow, and then we're also going to talk about the 8-game slate for Saturday. All conference championships. Then the following schedule will be a little bit weird after that. There won't be a show because it's just the Army-Navy week. Woo! And then we'll get into bowl season. There will be like for every single bowl, we'll have really in-depth information for all of the bowl games. There'll be shows, there'll be articles, there'll be betting information, just anything you could possibly need for betting and DFS purposes of the bowl season. I did tweet right before the show, and a good reminder, because Damian Martinez of Oregon State apparently got a DUI on Wednesday night and will not be playing in their bowl game when they do get selected to one. And I just want to, obviously we know that news, so we won't have to worry about it. But I wanted to remind everyone that bowl season is a tilt fest. You are going to have late scratches that were not talked about by anyone, surprisingly. And you're going to end up with some bagels in your lineup. There's going to be some guys who have played 3 snaps all year and end up scoring 5 touchdowns in the game. It's a total, a test of your patience and your will. And it just gets crazy, but it's fun, especially when you're on the opposite side of those late scratches. It's especially fun. So just got all that out of there. We're going to be getting into the slate here as we usually do. Jake, the season is just about over. It's kind of sad, but at the same time, it's been a long grind, but we have plenty of slates ahead. How have you felt about the overall season with, PrizePicks, betting, and just overall, watching the games?
Yeah, man. So it's been a good season, overall profitable season for sure. Hopefully continues to stay that way. Hasn't been as nuts on the PrizePicks. I feel like I hit a bit of a heater last season. Kind of funny because bought me a new air conditioner, but it was quite the PrizePicks season last year. It hasn't been hitting quite with the same frequency, or I'm hitting the 5 out of 6, or it's like I'm not quite getting there in the same manner with the same consistency, but that's the way it goes. But on the DFS side, I feel like have kind of really hit our groove, and also been on some really low owned plays throughout the season, which is part of the brand, and have had some really strong conviction on plays that a little bit off the wall sometimes, and sometimes they hit, but when they or sometimes they don't hit, but when they do, you kind of rocket up the leaderboard. So that's always been a focus, and I feel like we've been able to do a good amount of that this season, and it's been fun overall.
Yeah, definitely. And in the early weeks, especially, before people kind of have a grasp of what's going on. Lately, there's been a lot of overlap, but I feel like bowl season offers those who do the leg work, check the message boards, read the beat reports and all that other stuff for information about secret plays. So I'm looking forward to getting into that as well. All right, so we're gonna first talk about the 2-game slate, which is tomorrow. Obviously, we got the final iteration of the Pac-12 title game between America's team, the Washington Huskies, and those other guys, the Oregon Ducks. And then we have the title game between New Mexico State and Liberty. That's going to be a fun one as well. Lots of fantasy goodness in that game. At least it looks like on the initial outlook here. So we're going to kick things off and start off with that Liberty game. Looking at it, Liberty 11.5-point favorites, total of 57, which is pretty decent. Take it away, Jake. Let's delve into this one.
Yeah, man. So it's an interesting pairing of games in the 2-game slate, because I think a lot of the attention is going to be on the Oregon Washington game. Like, that's a much more high profile game, and like they're teams that are known to kind of light up the scoreboard. But I think Liberty and New Mexico State can kind of hang in their own right. And the nice thing about these two teams is the production is very condensed to kind of a limited few options. Whereas, not that Washington isn't, but Oregon can get kind of crazy with like 6 different guys catching passes at times. And so you can definitely take some pieces from this game. My favorite piece by far is Quentin Cooley. They've been giving him, all kinds of volume, and especially in competitive games, which they haven't had a ton of competitive games lately. But when they've been in competitive games, we've seen, carries in the mid to high 20s, hit a high of 28 carries against Jacksonville State in a game that he put up 163 yards and 2 touchdowns, and has had, at least a touchdown in all of the games since excluding the Old Dominion game, where it was just out of hand really early. But since week 6 has had a touchdown in just about every game, and typically multiple touchdowns. And so for him to be only 6,300, it feels kind of similar to our Krosky Merritt pick from last week that ended up being the stat line guy of the week. And he showed out pretty well. Didn't get the 3 touchdowns, but he did get 30 carries and 230 yards. I'm going on a tangent here, but I like that guy a lot. But Quentin Cooley is definitely my favorite play from this game. I think that a lot of folks are going to see Salter as a way to, save at the quarterback position. If you're not taking both of the quarterbacks from the Oregon-Washington game, which, you're going to be priced out of a lot of things you want to do if you do that. And so I think Salter is going to be popular just because he's, the quarterback who's on the team that's a favorite. And I think that's a mistake too. I not that he can't run it, and he will run it quite a ton, but I think that they are going to hand it off and control tempo and keep the Diego Pavia machine off of the field as much as possible. So I think that's going to lean Cooley. In lineups that you do run Salter, it also is not a must to run with his receivers. We talk about that a lot, and he's definitely going to trend towards running the ball frequently and get his production via the run frequently. And that is a reason to use him if you're going to use him, but I don't think he's necessary from that perspective today. But if you're going for like hey, maybe Oregon Washington ends up being a defensive battle for some reason, and this New Mexico State Liberty game shoots out, and you want to use Salter plus Cooley plus a piece in the passing game, I think you look no further than CJ Daniels as his kind of alpha, deep threat, big play threat, whatever you want to call it. At only 5,100, that's quite a bit more affordable than that type of receiver that sees both volume and deep targets would usually be. And I think we are probably not going to get Sibley. I think there's, enough of an injury there that he'll either be limited to a degree or not play at all. And so that means either, we get a ton of Daniels, or we spread the ball out, or we just run the ball a little bit on the Liberty side. We've seen Bentley Hanshaw pop at times, but he's going to be kind of touchdown dependent. And then way down at 3,200 as, a very viable salary saver, and you already know where I'm going with this, is Aaron Bedgood. He's kind of a Swiss Army knife for them. He's been very popular on the Tuesday, Wednesday slates that we've had earlier in the season as a guy that helps you kind of get to other things you want to do in your lineup, and usually is good for 5 to 7 touches in some fashion, and also has been returning kicks. So very good option on the low end there if you're trying to work in some high price pieces, which there are a lot of those. On the New Mexico State side, Diego Pavia at 6'6" is way too low. And this is a tougher defense than he's gone up against for sure. But he's developed so much over this season. Had a tough one against Jacksonville State, but crushed against Auburn, crushed in worse matchups. Like I think he brings it in this one. And at 6'6", if you are not using both of the QBs in the Oregon-Washington game, I would much prefer Pavia at 6'6" to Salter at 8'2". I just think game flow wise, it makes all the sense in the world. And Pavia is definitely able to run the ball in and score touchdowns through the ground. And he is pretty much the offense. I mean, they've gotten away from the plodding Star Thomas version of this offense, and it's become the Diego Pavia offense. And I very much am in on him at 6'6", as kind of a main lineup play, and then pick whichever guy you like more in the Oregon-Washington game. I think I know who Walt likes more, but go with your gut on that. As far as running backs go, not super interested in Star Thomas. Like I said, running game is focused more around Pavia anyway. As far as the receivers, it's been kind of a crapshoot on the New Mexico State side throughout the season. Most recent guy to spike was Trent Hudson down at 4,500, 570-1 in their most recent game against Jacksonville State. But Jonathan Brady has been a little bit more consistent early on in the season. And after that, it just gets really gross. But the main takeaway is Pavia and him getting it done mainly on the ground. So I would say my focuses from this game are probably Pavia, Cooley, and Bedgood are kind of who I'm most interested in deploying into a main type lineup. And it's only a 2-game slate, so it's hard to get too crazy with too many different iterations. And then if you are wanting to kind of buck that trend or go with somewhat of an alt play, Billy Lucas has seen some decent volume in the run game for Liberty. And so if you want to save down from the Cooley play, he's all the way down at 4K instead of the 6,300 that we are going to have to pay for Cooley. But Cooley is a good value at that price. So you can do either of those. I would lean Cooley for sure. But if you just can't get to anything you want in lineups and need to code down, there's no shame in taking Lucas, and maybe he gets into the end zone a couple of times and Cooley doesn't, and so you end up winning that battle that way. But that's about all I can consider from that game.
Yeah, I think Bedgood just, that was the play I was talking about in Discord earlier. Like, wow, 3-2. He's not obviously a slam dunk by any means, but shit, he's going to have probably a double digit, I would think, touches in this one, just because targets.
Yeah, and like you have to have realistic expectations. Like I don't think he's going to go for like 10 catches and 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Like he's not that dude, but he's going to get enough at 3-2 to make everything else work.
Exactly. So I do think when you're making, obviously, like you said, it's a 2-game slate, but making your main or whatever iteration there, I think you probably have to start with him. And it's nice because you get a semi running back kind of Swiss Army knife type at the wide receiver spot. And also on the other side for New Mexico State, it looks like Watkins' snaps are down. Jamani Jones' snaps are back up. That's a pretty lean play, but at 3-5, you're making some alt builds. Jones at 3.5, 5% ownership. Maybe he finds the end zone. That's not a horrible play at that price either. All right, so we're going to move along here talking about Washington versus Oregon. Now, Oregon, as it stands right now, is 9.5-point favorites, and we have a total of 65.5. And you are right, there's going to be a lot of people trying to stuff that entire game in there. I think Pavia at 6.6 is probably super chalky because he offers you such savings. And then Bedgood, then you can make the decision from there. And I think Cooley will probably go a little under-owned from where he normally would, so I like that play a lot too because you're right, he's going to get a ton of volume. And people are going to have to, throw down and go really cheap otherwise to get all these Huskies and Ducks in the lineup. So starting with the Oregon side, obviously I think you might have to just make the decision between Penix or Nix. I don't know if you're going to be able to play both. GPP lineup, sure. But if you're talking main, I think yes, Pavia, and then one of Nix or Penix. I am leaning, and it's blasphemous for me to say, but Bo Nix, the early part of the season, he really had to just sleepwalk through it, right? They're beating up on teams, and he wasn't necessarily needed to run the football much, and he's barely doing much, but still churning out 25, 28, 29 fantasy point games. Lately, they've been needing his offense and more of his rushing ability, and he's scoring touchdowns there, and he's actually engaged in the game the entire time, and he's putting up 35, 40, 45. So I just don't know that you cannot roster him in your main as much as I like Penix. The rushing upside with Nix just offers you a little bit more, and he hasn't been rushing as much as we've seen in the past. He only has 160 rushing yards this year, but 6 scores on the ground, 5 of which have happened in the last 4 or 5 games. So that's happening a lot more, and this will be a game here against Washington where he'll definitely be needed to do so. In that last game against Washington, he underperformed through 44 passes, 337 yards. Hard to say he underperformed, but for his price at $10K, he put up 28 fantasy points, just scored the 2 touchdowns. I think we're probably looking at a 4 touchdown minimum for Nick, so it's really hard for me to get away from him. As much as I love my Huskies, and I think defensively they'll hold up when they need to, but this will be a game where I think Nix comes out hot and by halftime has like 25 to 30 fantasy points. Like I'm pretty confident in that. So that's where I'm going there at quarterback. Bucky Irving is one at 6'9". I've been kind of fading him lately, and as chalk, he's been somewhat underperforming as well. And that might have a lot to do with the fact that, Bo Nix is starting to hammer away and do his thing. We did see against USC, Bucky put up 30, but the last 2 weeks he's been relatively quiet. I do expect him to be nearly unanimously owned across the board, though. So if you're looking for some large field, crazy play, fading Bucky Irving's not the worst thing in the world, but obviously in your main, you'll have to get him in there, especially since his price is 6.9. If you would have came into this like nearly 8K, it might have made a little more sense. Now, he did gash us for 130 yards last time he played, had 6 receptions, so just expect a lot of volume there for him. 4 or 5 GPP-wise, Jordan James, he is getting about 7 to 10 touches pretty consistently. Early in the year, he was putting up some pretty big numbers, and he did score a touchdown against us in that first one, had 14 touches in that game. So in your Bucky Irving GPP fade, you obviously want to play James because of that. Touchdowns are not going to Bucky. They're probably going to James or Nix. And then you mentioned Oregon's, receivers outside of Franklin. It does get a little dicey because they're pretty spread out. And 1 week it might be Bryant, 1 week it'll be Tez. Ferguson has done his job. In that last game against Oregon State, where they put their foot on their neck, the target share was really condensed for once, down to Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson. Franklin had 13 targets, Tez had 12, and both just absolutely murdered. I still like the savings we get with several of these Oregon receivers / tight ends. You're not going to be able to plug in Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson unless you're going to fade on the other side of Rome, which I would not recommend whatsoever. So that means probably trying to fit Franklin because he's just pretty much unstoppable at this point. Good for, 8 or 9 and catches and 100+ yards. You have the option to play one of the, Gary Bryant, Treshaun Holden, Terrence Ferguson group. Ferguson, primary tight end at 3.6. He would be my choice just because he's been pretty consistent for PPR wise. We're seeing, 3 to 5 catches over the last 5 games for him in 4 of the last 5, double-digit fantasy points in 2 of his last 3. Good for a touchdown. Like at 3.6, we don't need him to, 10 for 150. We just really need that 3 to 4 catches of 50 yards and a score, and I'm feeling pretty good about him being able to do that. Holden would be a nice GPP play because I think he wouldn't see much ownership. So with everybody probably going like Franklin Ferguson combo there, you can get Holden for a fraction of the ownership. Against Cali at 5.48-1. He's been relatively quiet since, but he is somebody with a lot of talent. Did get involved there against Oregon State. And again, it only really takes the 1 touchdown to pay off this sub 4K price point. It does look like Gary Bryant will go. I know there was talk of him possibly missing, but he's going to be A-okay. So another GPP sub 4K option there that you can use. In the Discord there, you had mentioned the Patrick Herbert. It took me a minute. I was slow. Didn't have any coffee yet to realize you were trolling about that one. But, stranger things have happened. Who knows? On the Husky side, the Rome Odunze play is just an absolute must. If you have to choose between Franklin and Odunze, it's a really tough spot to be in. And I mean, you're going to have to really punt a couple of spots. But both are going to generate so many fantasy points that it's probably the right move to do so. Rome is dialed in. Nobody can defend him one-on-one at the collegiate level. When they try, he just burns them. And as we saw against Wazoo, he was burning double teams as well. He's just ridiculous footwork, has enough speed to make guys miss, and he's just so very good and dialed in with Michael Penix. So Rome has got to be the guy. We can actually get away from Jalen Polk. I know that's really short-sighted of me because, he just had a bad game recently, but it really does coincide with the fact that Jalen McMillan, came back. They really featured McMillan early. He didn't do a lot in the second half, but I believe he had all 5 of his catches in that first half, and they were really just kind of peppering him and making sure to get him engaged because they're going to need him for this game. Jalen McMillan at 5.6 is a fantastic play. I would expect humongous, haven't used that word in a long time, ownership on him at that 5.6 price point because, this is a guy in years past put up 35, 40 fantasy point games. The 1B to Rome's 1A and finally, for the most part, healthy. They could afford to take it easy with him against Wazoo. And then when the game got really kind of lean and scary there, they just really, peppered Rome and ran the ball with Dylan Johnson amazingly and kind of got away from him. I do expect McMillan to be very, very involved in this particular game this time. So if you're running the 2 Husky receiver lineup, Rome and McMillan would be the way to go. I do think Polk's ownership takes a huge nosedive after last week. So again, that leverage opportunity there with him, 6.7 is a fair price if you look at his total body of work, but I do think he's negatively impacted by McMillan being back. You do have the tight ends, Jack Westover, who is there at 3.3, as well as Devin Culp, who's there at the min price 3K. You're hoping for a touchdown with those guys. Culp actually scored in back-to-back weeks prior. Hasn't been as involved. Targets have been down. Westover has been good for at least 1 reception. Against Utah, he had 7 for 64. They were really looking his way when Utah was decent enough to somewhat handcuff Rome throughout the third quarter in that game. So you have a guy at 3.3 who's going to give you, probably 5 to 8 fantasy points. Not a bad look there. One of Ferguson or Westover is likely probably a necessity too. Thankfully, we have Bedgood. I like him over both of the sub 4K tight end options on this game. But this is enough to make the ownership on Bedgood a lot leaner than it should be just because people want all the Oregon, Washington that they can possibly get. Running back wise, Dylan Johnson, I think any other week at 6K, the way that they've gone to him, he'd be a fantastic play. He did have a really nice, 100-yard, 1 touchdown performance, caught a couple passes for 22 fantasy points against Oregon when they played last time. The Oregon rush defense is definitely decent enough to give me pause about using him. Would much rather pay that 6.1 price point for Cooley, but it is important to notice that Dylan has had 20-plus carries in 3 of his last 4. This really shifted the offense. Defenses are playing them differently, although after the USC game, Utah, Oregon State, Wazoo, Wazoo maybe not as much, although their defense looked amazing in that last week's game. But Oregon State and Utah's defenses have been pretty good throughout the season. So they've had a string of tough matchups, which has led to more Dylan Johnson. I'd like to see him get more involved in the passing game in this particular matchup for the conference title, because that's where we saw him last year in the SEC, how good he can be as a pass catcher out of the backfield. And I think we do see some additional work for him in that regard. Again, he had 2 receptions against Oregon, and before that he had 5 for 48. So we know he can still do it. They just haven't been looking to him quite as often there. But one way or another, I do think he still sees somewhere between 15 to 20 touches. So if he can get there at 6K, definitely look to do so. Running back spot is super condensed between, Irving, who's going to be super chalky, and then probably Cooley, or people paying down for Lucas, Jones, God forbid, Star Thomas, who I hate as well. Not hate, I shouldn't say that, but don't like one bit either. There's really kind of lean options at the running back spot after that. Where we might see Dylan Johnson become relatively popular and because of that 6K price point. So I'm really interested to see how people end up making their lineups here. And then, of course, our guy, the Heisman hopeful, I think he's unfortunately falling out of the Heisman race here lately, but still love my man, Michael Penix. Really good upper tier GPP play. I just think he loses to Nix in the DFS realm for ownership. He's still going to probably see a decent chunk because it's 2-game slate, but I think he's clearly fourth. Of the 4 quarterbacks, I think he's probably the lowest owned, and that might kind of surprise some people, but price wise, it's just not going to be a possibility to run both of him and Bo Nix in a lineup unless it's a throwaway GPP where you're trying some things and maybe you're playing, Jamani Jones with Bedgood and a couple of these other cheapies, maybe James, just to make those 2 fit and hope that they just, got to go back and forth. I do think it's a game where Penix could throw for 404. Like this is the game here, right? Play and win and you're in, and kind of the final Pac-12 champion in the history of the world. So it's going to be a really, really big game. I already feel in knots about it. You had made the comment like, oh, well, it's watching NFL. It's because the Seahawks were on and I wanted to get myself like in the mood, but I couldn't get into it. But last week at the Apple Cup, like me and my older son were over, we're pacing holes in the floor. Like I am really excited about this game, and I'm already going to have like, I don't know, some THC gummies on hand or something, because I'm already stressing about it a ton. But that's pretty much the breakdown there. What let's get your take on the game too, because there's so many different ways to go, and I'm looking at the initial ownership projections. They're all over the place. Outside of Bo Nix and Bucky Irving, and obviously Franklin and Rome, there's just a lot of different ways you can go.
So yeah, well, I guess my first thing that I'm going to say about it is 10 points seems like a lot from a spread perspective. Like I don't see any scenario where it's like, well, Oregon got up 20 and like they're just going to salt the game away and Washington doesn't have a chance. Like that seems completely unrealistic, right? And so like this game is interesting on the last possession, right? Like there's no way that it comes down to like, oh, okay, we're just gonna run the clock out because we have like a 3-score lead. And so if that's the case, I'm pretty interested in the Washington side because they're gonna be undervalued and underowned. I like the Dylan Johnson call a lot. I think that the tendency is to break tendency in games like this, and like going to him in the passing game, exactly like you said, is what his strong suit is, but hasn't been tendency. Their tendency has been to throw it to their amazing trio of wide receivers, and that's what Oregon's going to be looking to take away. And I think whether it's Dylan Johnson or one of the tight ends underneath, I think that there's going to be a lot of room there with all the attention that's going to be devoted mainly to stopping Rome. And Rome will get his. Like, I'm not saying fade Rome because of that, but I think there's going to be some pretty easy chunk plays for somebody underneath, and Dylan Johnson's probably going to have the ability to be most explosive on those. And then he'll still get, plenty of volume in the passing game. So I do like that play a lot. And then I was trolling with the Herbert thing, but he did catch one of the 2 touchdowns in the previous matchup between these 2
True.
teams. And then he had that crazy game against was it Arizona State that he went absolutely bonkers and out of it. And so like you are not expecting another 378-2 game from Patrick Herbert, right? Like that's not within his skill set, but he could get in the end zone. Like there's nothing to say that, and he plays. He's a rotational pass catcher, and he's in mainly to block, but they'll throw him in, and especially when it comes to breaking tendency, like all the attention is going to be on the Franklin's and Tez's and trying to get up there and put a lot of men in the box, stop Bucky, especially like towards the goal line. And they're looking for Nix to run. The last thing they're looking for is to stop Herbert from catching a touchdown. Like no one's going to care about him. They think he's going to be there blocking. So it's a throwaway, but like there's a little bit of merit to it, right? And that said, Bedgood's a better one. Bedgood's still a better play. But if you want to change it up and get a little bit wild, it is really tough to fit all these high price guys though, man. Like how the receiver dynamic shakes out is really interesting because I almost want 0 piece of any receivers other than Bedgood in the Liberty game.
Yeah.
And so that means there's going to be so much ownership concentration in this one. So you just got to get really, really weird with combos, especially with it only being a 2-game slate. And so if there's a time to get like pretty off the wall with what you do, it's this. It's this 2-game slate and your upside, if you hit on all that weirdness, is immense because it's hard to get different, and if you do manage to get different and it hits, you're leaving everybody else in the dust. So I try to get extra contrarian on these 2 gamers.
Yeah, and the variance, like the amount of touchdowns that are going to happen probably in both games, like there's going to be a high degree of variance. So there's no reason not to take those shots because one of those guys could very easily score a touchdown and that no one else has, or like sub 5% to have. And that's such a huge edge, to have a guy at, that ownership on a 2-game slate. You just need a little bit of touchdown variance to go in your favor there. We won't use the L word, but you know what it is. And I haven't really played showdown slates too often in college football. It's just very few times, but I will be definitely playing the showdown. That 5K to first that they got is worth the shot there, and that's a good opportunity to get a little crazy there with some different plays. All right, we won't bother with it's a 2-gamer, kind of like there's no reason to really provide a core. You know where we're at and where most people will be. So we will jump over to the 8-game Saturday slate, which basically lasts all day. Starts off with the exciting Oklahoma State-Texas game, and then it ends with the Michigan-Iowa game, which I don't know how the schedule makers operate. I don't know, they'd take into account the other games on championships, probably not, but that wouldn't have been my first choice to end the slate on Michigan, Iowa. I would have much rather had that start us off so we could get it out of the way and have something like, I don't know, Georgia, Bama be the hammer game. But alas, we have Michigan, Iowa taking us home for the final time of a full regular season slate. So whoop-de-doo for that. We will start off this one with a MAC game, the MAC championship. Wanted to give that one to you. Miami of Ohio versus Toledo. This one is a 44 total. I'd like to see some little higher scoring action here for a MAC game. Toledo 8-point favorites. My man let me down last week, and he was super low owned too. Like we had some real nice calls last week that came through, especially in the running back spots again. But my Finn play, man, he just dogged me, and he wasn't very high owned either. So the upside in that one could have been massive, but a total letdown. Now his price is 7-8. So I'd like to go back to him, but I want to hear your take on this game here first.
Yeah, man. So part of that was like they just got up and didn't really need him to do his thing. And, he also, if you think about the history, he got hurt towards the end of last season and probably wasn't 100% for the MAC championship. And so that's probably a little bit in the back of their mind, getting up early against Central Michigan, okay, we don't need Finn to run it 20 times today. Let's kind of, run the running backs and let Boone go wild. But this is it. This is leave it all on the field time for Finn. I don't know that we necessarily see him in a bowl game, especially if he shows out here. And so, we'll see. Maybe he'll come back, but it's going to be. I like him a lot. I think this is his opportunity to, close out the regular season with a bang and leave it all on the field and show everything that he didn't show last week. And so, as low owned as he was last week, I think there's probably an opportunity for him to be just as low owned, if not even more so, on, an all day slate like this where I think people do pay attention to the order of games sometimes and don't, and I think you've referenced that or said that before, if he starts slow, kills the whole lineup, kills the whole day, I think people might tend to avoid him for that reason too, especially with what happened last week. And I think that's a mistake. I think, he's going to have a 100 rush yard, 2 touchdown upside type game. There's no reason that Toledo shouldn't dominate this game. Avion Smith on the other side is not a quarterback that can run a sustainable offense. They struggle kind of with him. They're going to struggle against Toledo. And so I think Toledo easily controls this game and gets whatever they want. It's going to come down to, is it Finn or is it Boone that gets it done? And the last 4 games, it's been Boone, and sometimes they both get there, and it's nothing to say you can't do that. But I think just with all of the context around this one and, him and Finn not being fully healthy in the previous MAC championship and not really being able to showcase his skill set and needing to this time around for, his career potential, talking about the next level. I think that this is just like the Daquan Finn showcase game. And, if there's the opportunity at the 4-yard line to hand it off or to let him run it in, I think that we're going to see him run it in. That's just, there's no rhyme or reason to that. That's more of a gut feeling. But I do believe in that gut feeling. And I also don't think that we're going to see a 20-25 carry Penny Boone game. I think it's going to be a lot more volume on either quarterback runs or in the passing game. Would like to see some kind of consistency or reliability in this passing game. I think part of the issue for Finn all season has been he doesn't really have that alpha pass catcher, that we kind of thought or suspected Jerwan Newton should be and has been at times this season, but he's not as consistent. And the most catches he's had in a game is 6. He doesn't have that 12 catch guy that's going to just pile up volume and be a lock. But in this one where, we are going to go to Finn and I think that, he is going to air it out a decent amount as well as run it, and getting Newton at 4.7 is key. I mean, if Newton were at 6.5, I'd be like, I don't really want to do all that. But Newton at 4.7 is really, really compelling because that, that combo of Finn, who will be low owned, and Newton, who will probably also be very low owned and is cheap, allows you to do a lot when I think there will also be a good amount of ownership on Boone, rightfully so. He's been fantastic lately, nothing against him. But I just think there'll be more of a focus on the passing game. And on the other side of it, and I guess, we can give a bit of a shout to Vander Ross. pretty thin play, not a lot of volume. If you do want, to use another pass catcher and not go to Newton, if you think 4.7 is too expensive, want to drop down to 3.7 instead. He's going to get a little bit less volume and have to do it on efficiency and probably have to get in the end zone to really get you there. But, he also could catch that 60-yard touchdown, right? So we can go to Vander Ross too. I don't want to shy away from that too much. That is something I would probably do only in a Finn lineup, whereas I could see, using Newton in a non-Finn lineup, just a little bit more stability to that. So that's pretty much it on the Toledo side. I'm not interested in a whole heck of a lot on the Miami of Ohio side. Definitely not interested in Avion Smith. I think Rashad Amos at 6.2 is okay. I don't necessarily love the game script for them. I don't think that they're going to have the ball a ton. I don't think they're going to be able to get a ton going on the ground. It is, a D that you can attack. It is a rush D that you can attack, but I see Toledo not really needing to do much in terms of respecting the pass and being able to stack the box and get a good amount of 3 and outs. And that usually leads to frustration and inconsistency for the running back when they're going to be, down early and down to an offense that is getting pretty much whatever they want. So Amos is probably the only one that's interesting, but he's not even that interesting. And then just nothing in the passing game for me. Smith is not talented enough to make any of these pass catchers that aren't even that cheap. Got the top receiver, Laverdane at 5.1, and the other two, McDonald and Wilkins in the low 4 range. Like, it's not interesting. And Toledo's been pretty tough against the pass anyway. And so, Amos, but not really even Amos is kind of my take on that side of it. So Finn plus a receiver is fine. Boone also fine, but Finn is the main target for me from this game.
Yeah, I love the going back to Finn call because I agree. Like, he was what I honestly did not. I was way wrong. Usually I've been pretty good about like close with ownership. He was way lower owned than I thought. Like, I don't know. I just totally whiffed that one. But I feel good about that this week and knowing that, yeah, it's an 8-game slate. It's smaller than we've been having, but I think people would be a little burnt off in Boone, who wasn't that highly owned last week either, who I had a lot of, just nuked it. And you're right. I think people would have the tendency to go back there, especially since he's, 3 of his last 4 just been well over 100 yards. And I think if anything, people are going to concentrate there. But this is a great spot for Finn. I think we see him bounce back in a huge way. And there's really no reason for them not to keep their foot on the gas if they do, jump out, in my opinion. And the defense of Toledo has been solid enough that, yeah, there's not a lot of interest for me on that Miami Ohio side either. I
think the other sorry to just jump back in. The other thing that I didn't mention, this is one of a few games that is in a dome. And so, dome offenses, domes tend to generate a little bit more offense. And obviously there's no weather component. And there is one of the games on the slate that is going to have kind of a weather component to it. So that even more so would lead me to using Finn.
Yeah. Michigan, Iowa's in a dome too, just so offensive explosion coming there too. But yeah, no, all I was going to say is that Avion Smith, like at 5.8, maybe perhaps like there's going to be the most passing volume he's had all year, which he just threw 24 times against Ball State, which is like 50 for anyone else. Very lean.
But is that a good thing?
What's that?
But is that a good thing? If Avion
no, definitely no, exactly. His accuracy isn't great. You definitely want him to be running. So just looking at an angle there where maybe you can get something, but yeah, I'm with you. I'm kind of wanting to go back to Finn, and I feel like that our community might kind of groan a little bit, but I mean, just such a great bounce back spot, and I don't mind using him with Boone. Like I did that last week, and I think there's a path for both of them to succeed. A lot of money, but it could work. All right, we're going to go over to Boise State versus UNLV, the Mountain West Championship. Boise State, there is another dome game here. The Boise State team, they've been kind of a late night staple for us. We have had a fantastic season from Ashton Jeanty. He's been just spectacular. He is crazy expensive, right? $8K, but this is a spot against UNLV where he could absolutely nuke. Now they do have George Holani as well, who's sitting there at 6'3". I think that'll be the play we see in a lot of our opponents' lineups. And he's since he's been back, he's been consistently getting 20 touches minimum, a big time factor. He came back in week 9, and there's been a path for both he and Jeanty to get touches and perform. Ashton's a lot more efficient, and he has been really good this year, over 1,100 yards, 6.1 YPC. So his carries, unfortunately, they were 24, 26, 31, have now dropped significantly. He did miss a couple of games in there too, but the last two to finish out the season, 12 carries for 85 yards and a score, 14 carries for 107 and a score, but also 5 receptions for 118 yards and a touchdown. Now, Boise State's receiver room, it's pretty tough with McAllister, gone since week 10, decided he didn't want to finish out the season and go to the transfer portal. They have some young talent that is super raw. It's going to take time for them to develop. They show flashes, but really there's nobody they can rely on in this receiver room. So what happens is Jeanty's turning into kind of a slot guy, and there's times where he's on the field with Holani and operating as the receiver in that situation. So you can still use him. 8K is a lot when you're not getting the bulk of the work and you're getting a split backfield, but his work as a receiver as well makes him a very appealing option. So I like him a lot. It's going to be tough to fit him, but just know that I think most people are going to go Holani, not Ashton Jeanty. So kind of have that in your mind where you can find some leverage. There might even be a path to playing both of them, because I don't think UNLV defense is going to contain either. And you also have the element with Tulane Green here, who is only 6'7". He was a DFS darling to end, last year when, Bachmeier got booted out of town. He's in the portal again, by the way. And Green hasn't really been that great this season. Rushing numbers down because of how good Ashton's been, but he has scored. He has 7 rushing touchdowns, so there is that element. Passing, he hasn't had to throw a lot, but he has 3 passing touchdowns in his last 2 games, despite not throwing more than 17 attempts in either of those games. Looking at it, it appears he's trending to be somewhat popular, not a massively high owned. I'm not even sure that any of the quarterbacks on the slate really will see like 50 or 60% ownership anywhere. I think it's going to be spread out, but I do foresee Green maybe at 6'7" being someone that people do look at. And then we're going to get the question of like, hey, who can I pair with him? I need a guy with my quarterback. He's not somebody that you need to use with the receiver, and he is a quarterback, much like Finn and some other ones that we've done throughout the season. You can run the running back with him because of that passing volume, and all of that usage is going to go to those guys. Holani, Jeanty, and Green are going to soak up all of that usage. You might see, a breakout catch from Austin Bolt or Prince Stracton, both of them near min price. Those are the guys who are kind of the future of this team. Boise State message boards all about those guys. They haven't been very consistent. The passing game is not really the strength of this team. So they're cheap, but I would really tend to focus on either Holani or Jeanty, and then possibly Green there. On the UNLV side, we have a cheapie in Jaden Mareva at 6'8". So another, relatively cheap quarterback in the same price range of Green that does similar things. Has a little bit of rushing upside, but his overall upside is much better, I think, than Green, because he can actually pass. Air Force, in a game against Air Force at that, over 300 yards, which is totally impressive when you consider, time of possession issues that sometimes happens when you play a team like Air Force. And then he followed that up against San Jose State in a shootout game. They ended up losing, but another 29 attempts, threw for over 220 yards. It was one of his weaker games in the past 4, but there's just a ton of volume from him, and he's been pretty damn efficient as well. Over 2,600 yards. 14 touchdowns to 6 interceptions and 250 rushing yards as well, with another 3 touchdowns. So 6'8". He's actually one of the favorite quarterbacks of mine, aside from Finn, who I always like, and there's several that are in play in this slate, but I certainly like Mabe at 6'8" and think he's a great play. And I do want to pair him with a receiver if I do end up using him. Ricky White, who transferred a couple of years ago from the Michigan State, 10 targets, 5 catches, 113 yards in that last game. He's been a very consistent option in WR1 for this UNLV team. And you look at his stat line, it's Madden-esque. 111, 169, 144, 166, 152. The last time he didn't hit 120 plus receiving yards was back in week 8 when he still had 9 catches for 74. Then he had 174. The first couple of the games this season, they played Michigan, Vanderbilt, UTEP. He had a couple of weaker games there, did blow up against Vanderbilt, but obviously Michigan humbled him. But since that game, he's just been an absolute animal. With this type of production, he should definitely be like 8K. So getting him at 6'7" is a nice little discount. We have affordable quarterbacks that we can utilize, and we can expect a guy like Ricky White, just because of his box scores alone, to see a very, very large ownership. But he actually backs it up. It's not a blip. He's just too good in this league, and it's just a very obvious play. So he's definitely going to be a core receiver play for me. We can make that salary work because I don't think we're going to have to pay up at quarterback on both spots. And White's just far and away one of the best receivers on the slate. 115 targets, 75 catches, 1,300 yards, and 7 touchdowns. Like, I don't think people realize what he's been doing, because UNLV and Mountain West football in general, I don't know that a lot of people pay attention to it this year, but he's just been super, super good. So all over him there with his quarterback. It's a really nice pairing. Not super involved or interested in their running backs. They do have Vincent Davis, who was at Pittsburgh a year or two ago, and Jaden Thomas, who splits. Thomas had a pretty big game, 48 rushing yards, 3 scores, but just 10 carries. That's not something you can really rely on for him either. So when it comes to this UNLV team, I'm looking at the receiver quarterback pairing, and then on the other side for Boise State, one of those running backs between Genty and Holani, maybe even both in some lineups there. I think I'll be running, 5, 6, 7 different lineups here just to have different action and different exposure levels to these guys, because I don't think one lineup's going to be enough. There's several that I want here to use. So that's where my head's at with this one. I'll ask you, where are you at the moment? The Chalky or Holani, or maybe some leverage on an expensive option like Genty? Where's your head at with those two?
Man, if you can get to it with Genty, that's just he's so explosive, and like every play could be a touchdown, and you'd have so much leverage over the Holani lineups. You just got to find a lot of value elsewhere, because it's a running back spot, which those are viable. We always want to make sure that we get the most out of those, and it's a lot of salary allocation. Frankly, I'm not super high on using either of them, but if I were to use one of the two, I'm probably leaning Genty on that. I'm with everybody else on Ricky White. I mean, he's too good and too explosive, but probably Genty between those two.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's tough because of that price, but God, he's just so good, and he's the type of player that will, in this time of the year and into their into the any type of bowl games too, like will put up 4 touchdowns, like an Appalachian State running back or something. It's just I foresee him having a huge game. All right, we'll move on to the next one here, which is going to be Oklahoma State versus Texas. Texas comes in as a 15.5-point favorite and a total of 55. This is going to be a high-scoring slate. There's a ton of higher totals, and I think we're going to see one of the higher-scoring slates that we've seen in a while. Texas, obviously no Brooks, which is tough, but that offense still looks really good. Oklahoma State's defense has been very, very mediocre. Of course, there's Ollie Gordon on the other side. There's some serious firepower still in this game. Who are we liking here?
Yeah, very, very mediocre is a very charitable way of describing it. 34 points to BYU last week, 30 to Houston the week before, 45 to UCF. Yeah, they're going to be points scored on this Oklahoma State defense. And it's weird for a championship game to have a 15-point spread for sure. I think this warrants it because Texas's defense it has been showing up, all season for the most part, and didn't stop last week against Texas Tech, rivalry game, and the only shot that Oklahoma State is going to have is being able to keep up, and I don't see that happening. Obviously, they have been running the offense through Ollie Gordon, at least in the second half of games, each of the last 2 weeks. It's been hey, we got him in the first half, contained Ollie Gordon, and then he shows up for 4 touchdowns in the second half somehow, or 5 touchdowns last week, and so. I don't think he's going to get to 5 touchdowns against Texas. Big claim to fame or line in the sand play there. Ollie Gordon fewer than 5 touchdowns, but I do think Texas controls this one and can kind of get whatever it wants. The question is going to be, what does it want to do, right? So. Generally, Texas has wanted to run the ball when they get, when they have the ability to do whatever they want. We've seen them run it. The question is going to be, are they going to do that with Blue or with Baxter? And I was a little bit of an eyebrow raise on the pricing with Jaden Blue, who hadn't seen more than 7 carries all season and only had 10 against Texas Tech, but made the most out of those 10 carries, going for 121 yards and touchdown, and then getting a couple passes and getting involved in the passing game as well when Baxter went down with an injury. Baxter is healthy for this one. Like he's gonna be ready to go at 5,600. He's cheaper than Jaden Blue. I mean, I kind of have to lean Baxter there, right? Like, yep. Yes, Jaden Blue is going to be involved in he's obviously very explosive, but he's not going to continue at 12 yards a carry. Against Oklahoma State, it's possible, but you can't expect him to continue at 12 yards a carry. And Baxter has seen the volume, 18 carries against TCU and then 20 against Iowa State. And this is an offense defense that very much can be attacked on the ground in all aspects, but that Harvey UCF game and just all kinds of things can happen against this Oklahoma State defense on the ground, and Baxter at 5,600 is extremely appealing. I think that's a place that I'm going to start a lot of lineups with. It just makes too much sense. If you disagree with that notion and you think that this is we want to showcase Quinn Ewers and reaffirm that he's the man, and maybe upset some other quarterbacks that are in that program and they end up going to the transfer portal, but give Ewers an opportunity to show that this is his job going into next season with the game in hand. Maybe you do see them pass the ball a little bit more, and he has the explosive options that can make that worthwhile, and maybe you see him run it in on the ground a time or two, as we've seen him do, not a ton recently, but we know he's capable of it. So if you're going the Ewers route, you got to pair him with Worthy. Worthy's far and away the most explosive option they have, with all due respect to A.D. Mitchell and our boy Jatavian Sanders down there at 3.7. You're going to get the most explosiveness and bang for your buck with Worthy at 6.5. But that's not my preference. My preference is still to use Baxter, and I think that Worthy was at 6.2, not 6.5. I said 6.5. But Baxter is just kind of the way to go. Now on the other side, fading Ollie Gordon, it is not for the faint of heart, but he's going to be involved in the offense, but he's not going to have the same amount of efficiency. He just can't. Texas is going to have the ball too much. They're going to be trailing too quickly in the game. They're not going to be able to turn it over to him and run the ball 25 times in the second half. And that's how he gets his legs under him. That's how he gets his momentum. that's how, the touchdowns start piling up. And that's how, if you did, not necessarily use him in a lineup and saw your score falling through the end of the slate last week, that's why. It was because Ollie Gordon was just doing his Ollie Gordon thing. But I don't see him doing anything near that. That's a ridiculous thing to expect against anyone, but especially against a Texas defense that is perfectly suited and frankly has no reason to respect Alan Bowman. I think, we're going to see a pretty overmatched and overwhelmed Alan Bowman early in this one. And we're going to see Texas's defense kind of take over and set the tone early, giving Texas the opportunity to kind of control the game. And I think we're going to see a very inefficient game from Ollie Gordon. And it's going to be kind of like the first half of his last two games where he didn't really do much. And, you were sweating if you rostered him at 8K or 8,800, whatever he was at. And so, yeah, as painful as it is, because what he's capable of, I think you got to jump off the Ollie Gordon train now. Now that said, Oklahoma State's still going to have to do something on offense, and despite how bad Alan Bowman has been in the past, he's still been able to lock on to a handful of targets. I mean, Brennan Presley, I don't know what his target count over the last 3 or 4 weeks is, but it's got to be pretty high. 8 catches, 5 catches, 15 catches, 9 catches in games that, were pretty competitive throughout, but they were leading. And this is a game where we don't expect that to be the case. We expect them to be trailing. So could we see a 20 catch Brennan Presley game if Alan Bowman can throw 20 completions in one game? I think we might. There's going to be a lot of volume to him. There's going to be a lot of men stacked in the box against Ollie Gordon, so he should have room to operate. And if Oklahoma State's line can hold up and Alan Bowman can be accurate enough, I think we can see a big one out of Brennan Presley at 5.5. That's extremely intriguing. And similarly, Leon Johnson III at 5K and Rashad Owens at 4.8 are also viable options. I don't necessarily want to use Bowman, even though all of his receivers are good options. I think there will be a handful of turnovers of some variety from Bowman, whether that be fumbles or interceptions that, excuse me, even at 6'1", it's not a place that I want to go. And he's got no rushing upside at all. I mean, he's going to get sacked plenty in this one. And, he's not a big rusher to begin with, but whatever he is able to accomplish positively in the passing game will be negated by sacks to a pretty large degree. And then turnovers will only exacerbate that further. So can't really use Bowman, but I do have interest in all three of his receivers, most so in Presley.
Yeah, I think Presley, he has got 33 targets in the past 2 games, so he's just locked in. It's ridiculous. It's made Owens still producing, actually. He's just, his target share was, when Presley was out, it was really high, and it's gone down, but he's still making those grabs. And my man Johnson, who burned his red shirt, he's had that big game against BYU. So I agree that some of this Oklahoma State, receiver group here is cheap enough and viable enough to certainly use. I am also leaning towards, fading Ollie Gordon. I think a lot of people will. This would be the week if you ever wanted to play Ollie Gordon at lower ownership, like sub 20%. This is probably the week, just because it is an exorbitant amount of money. He's faced UCF, Houston, and BYU over the last 3 games. Obviously, the UCF game was a disaster, but those are 3 really poor defenses, and Texas is got the athletes and future NFL pros to really make life difficult for him. And I think his YPC is going to be really quite lowly. So I'm a little bit nervous there, but he will certainly be in a GPP lineup, because you're telling me I can have Ollie Gordon upside at 15%. I don't know if he ends up being that low, but I have a feeling he might. I have to have exposure, because that just feels way too good. And then, a classic spot here for our man Jatavian Sanders at 3.7. He hasn't really been getting it going this year. It was way better for us last year. Started the season hot. we haven't really talked about him much, haven't used him much, but I wouldn't be surprised to see Sanders catch a touchdown here at 3-7. So that's my shout for this one. All right, we move on to the AAC championship between SMU and Tulane. Got a lot to say about this one. Tulane 3.5-point favorites is a total of 47. We'll start with the SMU side. A absolute, you wanted a preview of potential bowl game shenanigans. We got it last week for those of us that unfortunately had LJ Johnson exposure. It was a very good matchup for SMU running backs, which was why I wanted to use LJ Johnson, because Navy has just been horrible. And Tyler Levine scored 3 touchdowns. So it hurt just a little bit more knowing that LJ Johnson was available, but did not see a single snap after rushing for back-to-back 100-yard games and 20-plus carries in each of those games just to go poof. Now, the coaching staff, more specifically head coach Rhett Lashley, has said he is available and good to go, but there is absolutely no way I can really justify SMU running backs. I haven't really used them when they're on the slate anyways. That was just a spot to play Johnson. 5-1 is a really good price. If you have those multi-entries, you can rotate through some of these guys, because we've waited for Kamara Wheaton season for 2 years now, and he's still uber talented, but somebody on this SMU running back room is going to do fairly well in this game. It's just hard to say which one it'll be. I knew we were in trouble last week when Belton Gardner got into the game, and before Johnson, I knew something was a muck there. So that's a tough pill to swallow, but that 5-1 price point for him is still very intriguing if he gets back to normal 20 carry workload. Won't have obviously, it's maybe a surprise to some people, but Preston Stone, who was just super surgical against Navy rather than having Johnson. He, on 19 attempts, 14 completions, threw for 322 yards and 3 touchdowns. But he did suffer a broken fibula, so there is no Preston Stone for this one, which is a very tough loss for them to endure. This SMU offense tends to be kind of super pass heavy and prolific, regardless of who's coaching or who is at the quarterback spot. They've just been consistent for years. But Tulane is definitely a tougher spot. The quarterback that steps in there is Kevin Jennings, who is at 6'4". Way less excited about him. I probably wouldn't have paid 8-4 for Stone anyways, but it's hard to deny how much passing volume and how good he's been. Jennings this year, in parts of 5 games, has thrown for 220 yards, 3 touchdowns, and rushed for 22 yards on 11 carries. Also scored a rushing score. So I suspect that the SMU run game will be relied upon here. But Jennings, in that mop-up duty that he's seen, has been fairly accurate, of course, against lesser-known teams, though. And then the SMU receiver room, we didn't do too bad with the Keyshawn Smith play there at 3-2. 3 catches for 58 yards. He was actually pretty solid. He ended up having 4 targets in that game. He had a reception that was taken away. I swear with my own eyes I saw it, but they credited it to RJ Maryland instead. Which is weird because, one's a tight end. But spread out as always. You had 4 different receivers on this team with 3+ targets, and then you had a total, not including the halfbacks, of 9 receivers with at least 1 target. So it's continuing to be spread out. That's been the case all year long. SMU is such a frustrating squad. I do suspect that we'll see a little bit of love for Moochie Dixon, who was only 4K and had that just, ridiculous, just a game that you'll see out of anyone. 4 catches for 125 yards and 2 touchdowns. I believe those 2 touchdowns came in the first half. Navy's defense, I'm talking, is really bad. And he just completely made them look silly. So I think we'll probably see a little bit of, ownership there. RJ Maryland has been one of the target share leaders at 4.6. He's okay. If anything, with a newer quarterback coming in there will be a tendency to rely on the tight end. So he would be one of the safer options there. Jake Bailey, who came from Rice 2 years ago and looked like he was going to be a star early in the season, has not been the same since he got injured and missed most of last season. Hasn't been really that great of a play. Jordan Hudson has shown flashes, but he's really kind of ordinary as well, although he has been scoring touchdowns with high frequency, so he's finding the end zone. Granted, that's with Preston Stone. And then my man Keyshawn Smith is still down there, near min price at 3.2. I don't mind that. If you need some salary savings there with Smith, I could certainly get behind using him. But I think Dixon is probably the only one we have to worry about seeing on any opponent lineups of ours. Tulane side, I haven't done a lot of Michael Pratt lineups. Early in the season we did, but he got injured. He's already kind of, I don't know if he actually announced it, but his team let slip that he's going to be looking for a new area code next year, going to probably hit the portal. 8K is a little bit spendy. He hasn't really warranted that price point. He's had several 30 fantasy point games, definitely. And I wouldn't be shocked to see him throw 2 or 3 touchdowns here, maybe even score one, but that's just a lot of salary to put in there against a SMU team that defensively are, they're not horrible by any means. They're not elite, but they're certainly not a sieve. For the most part, it's about Mekhi Hughes again, who's finally priced somewhat appropriately at 6.4. The last couple of slates, he's been under 6K and just an absolute auto lock. We're talking about a guy getting nearly every single snap at the running back spot. 26 carries against UTSA, 170 yards and a touchdown. He's been pretty automatic for the most part. You could, maybe make a case for fading at 6.4, but I don't know why you would want to. I just feel like he's going to continue to get that heavy volume. So we're going to continue to go with him. As of this moment, he is over 1,200 rushing yards, 7 touchdowns. Not much of a pass catcher. That's one area of his game I'd like to see more of. But YPC of 5.4, consistently getting 20-plus carries. Continue to roll him out. At the wide receiver spot, there won't be any Keys. Lawrence Keys will be out, so that kind of muddies the waters there or opens up some things. But Jaquan Jackson is expected, or at least they're optimistic about his ankle injury. But the only receiver you really want to look at is at 5.4K here, the redshirt freshman Chris Brazzell, who has been really, really good the last few weeks. 3 touchdowns in total of 2 games, 26 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games, and he has been the super highly targeted. Granted, without Keys and Jackson, even if Jackson returns, I think Brazzell is still a pretty solid play, especially so on FanDuel where he's like 7.2. I think we see some big ownership on him there, but he's a nice look at 5.4. If you're for some reason not using Hughes and you want to get some exposure to Tulane, he would be the way to do it, most definitely. But overall, outside of Hughes, I don't have a strong passion for any of the plays here. I'm certainly burnt on SMU. I think that there will be somebody on this SMU roster that has a slate breaking performance at 2% ownership, but it's a real crapshoot to decide who it's going to be here because LJ Johnson available, but we're not sure if what that actually means after getting apparently the DMP CD version of whatever that is in football. So I'm a little too scared to use any of these SMU guys beyond a alt lineup. So I'll probably have to begrudgingly throw Johnson in the lineup because the DFS gods like to torture me. When a player busts super hard, they usually go off the week after. So I'll protect myself there. But overall, we're on the Mekhi Hughes train and moving on to the next stop. Do you have anything you want to add to this one?
Yeah, I mean they rotate. The SMU rotates the running backs a lot anyway, so it's like you might get Johnson back, but okay, now you have one more mouth to feed, and if they all go for 8 carries and 43 yards, like okay, well whatever. No one's really gonna sink you at that. So I'm kind of on that train of fading SMU running backs in general. Not trying to force Moochie Dixon in there. I feel like that was pretty flash in the pan. I guess my overall takeaway, I'm kind of curious to get your betting take on this, but like SMU has a backup quarterback.
Yeah.
They're playing against Tulane, which is playing a home game, and Tulane is only a 3.5 point favorite. Like I would have put this not huge into capping games or anything, but I would have put this closer to like 7.5 to 8 for Tulane. Like that would have been kind of my my thought in terms of like the way everything is trending. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. That's it. Looking at it, I was like, well, what am I missing? Is somebody out? Like, is Pratt going to be sitting? Like, I don't understand it either. Because yeah, without Stone, who that's a pretty big deal. And they're giving SMU a lot of respect. And Tulane is a very methodical and when they get rolling, especially on the ground, they're a hard team to beat, and they kind of just wear teams out. So I agree. The 3.5 spread is pretty lean. I would almost think that they're going to win this by 2 score, 10 to 14 points even. So I definitely like that. Sprinkle the money line. The total of 47, which is already not very high, but I feel like even the under 47 would be in play there. But that's definitely, out of all of these, stands out as one that kind of seems
feels like there isn't going to be much continuity to the SMU offense with trying to mix in all those running backs and work in a new quarterback taking his first meaningful snaps. Like, that just seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, you can, and so there's a pretty nice SGP there of taking the spread, and under 47 I think would work out pretty well. So definitely a good call out there. All right, moving on, we have the SEC title game. Same thing every year, it feels like, almost, right? Georgia versus Alabama. I know we've had LSU in the mix there, but this is going to be an absolute war. There's going to be a lot of eyeballs on this one. Georgia 5.5 point favorites, 54.5 total. There's been a ton of chatter from different CFB media members talking about, Alabama, if they win, they're in. You got to put them in versus Texas. Like, the Alabama versus Texas discussion has just been dominating Twitter, so I'm getting kind of sick of that. I'd like to see Georgia just kind of put them out of their misery anyways. But what are we doing in this one? Because, defenses are solid, but this is the title game, and we know their offenses are going to show out.
Yeah, man. So everyone's like all on the Alabama train now. Did everybody just like not watch the Iron Bowl and the fact that Alabama needed a miracle 4th and 31 to beat Auburn at the last second, who's not even ranked? Like,
Yeah.
This Alabama team is not on the same level as Georgia. Like, no one's really made Georgia sweat. No one's, I mean, like, they've had their challenges, but like no one was really sweating a Georgia loss at any point. Like, Alabama very much should have lost that Auburn game. And I feel like if they did, if Jalen Milroe doesn't pull off a miracle at the end of that one, the vibe and the narrative to this game is extremely different. It'd be like, oh my gosh, Alabama just lost to Auburn. Their season is over. They're going to roll over. And like, that's basically what is happening. Like, they are that team much more than they are the team that can compare with Georgia or compete with Georgia. And like, it's the difference of one play that changes that narrative. So, that none of that has anything to do with DFS. It's just kind of like an interesting way to look at it. I've been a really big fan of Jalen Milroe, and like that play was great. He didn't have a very good game against Auburn. Like, it was a very herky jerky, not much continuity to it. Didn't have the same like rhythm to his reads that he had against Tennessee or LSU or Kentucky. And I don't think Auburn has this like amazing defense. I think it's just sometimes we're going to get some inconsistency from Jalen Milroe, and we're definitely going to get some inconsistency from Jalen Milroe against Georgia. So I'm a big fan of his, big proponent of his. Maybe if he gets, a pretty good matchup in a bowl game, we can use him again. But I don't think we're using Jalen Milroe at 9K against Georgia. That's just not really a thing that can happen. There's also, some intrigue in the running game. Not that you're jumping out of your chair to use running backs against Georgia, but Jace McClellan got pretty banged up in the Auburn game and may not be and wasn't in there at some pretty crucial times. And it was Roydale Williams that was getting some pretty key carries. And so if for some by some means, in some reason, we get news that Jason McClellan is going to miss this one, or be, at some in some limited capacity, to the extent that like we're going to see more Roydell Williams, even against Georgia. Roydell Williams at 4K is in play. Like, it's still the Alabama offense. Like, he's still going to get carries. He could still find his way into the end zone once. This isn't the same Georgia defense as last year. They're not impenetrable. And if he ends up being a starting running back for an Alabama offense at 4K, that's at least in consideration. I also think that there's a lot of merit in going back to a name I've shouted out a few times, which was Kendrick Law, who they use more or less as a decoy and gadget guy. But if there's ever a spot that a decoy and gadget guy could break loose, and have some plays drawn up for him, and he's had multiple touchdowns on end arounds and kind of weird trickery type plays that have been called back on holding penalties. And if they are able to get him involved on something like that and avoid holding in this one, I feel like this is very much a Kendrick Law spot. He's down there at 3.3, so it's a GPP shout for sure, but somebody to look to on the Alabama side. I don't have a ton of interest in like the Burton and Bond type plays. They're priced up for what the expectation should be on them, going up against a pretty tough secondary in Alabama, on the Alabama side, or on the Georgia side. And so that's probably all I'm going to have interest in is Roydell Williams if we get the Jason McClellan injury news, and then also Kendrick Law for cheap GPP type flyers on the Alabama side. On the Georgia side, feel similarly with this one as I do with Tulane. This is, it's not a home game, but like it's pretty much a home game for Georgia. And there's the difference in talent is so huge, especially on the defensive side. I don't think Auburn was putting up 24 points against Georgia at any point this season, right? So I think Georgia just has such an easy time in this one, and rolls and solidifies what I think should be a correct number one ranking in the CFP, and they have every incentive to keep the foot on the gas as long as possible to do that, because they're going to be playing before Michigan does, right? And so do we get a massive Carson Beck game where he shows up as the second coming of Stetson Bennett and just throws the ball all over the place? Do we get the Dan Edwards show, who has been a guy they've kind of allowed to breathe a little bit and haven't used a ton in games where they had things under control, or do we see Kendall Milton, who just absolutely went off against Georgia Tech? It's an interesting question. I do think they lean towards the passing game a little bit in this one. That would be going with the trend of breaking tendency. Georgia airing it out a good amount would be breaking tendency a little bit. Both Bowers and McConkey decided not to go in the Georgia Tech game. And, people will look at that score and be like, oh, Georgia only won by, one score against Georgia Tech. What was going on with that offense? Well, the two biggest weapons in that offense were missing. And so it was kind of like, hey, we're going to have to just turn this over to the ground game and let them do their thing, which doesn't lead to as explosive of an offense. And so very methodical, very under control, but most importantly, gave Bowers and McConkey a chance to get healthy. And if you want a like very kind of edge case, low probability but high upside stack, a Carson Beck, Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, and Kendrick Law bring back would be a very interesting thing to do. I see, a lot of success for Georgia in the passing game, especially with what Auburn was able to do. And, Georgia will be able to scheme up against that. And I also see Kendrick Law on the other side being kind of that forgotten man and guy with a lot of speed that doesn't get as much attention paid to him. I don't think we're going to see a multiple touchdown Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint game. I think that is probably an anomaly, and I don't think we're going to see a massive Dom Lovett volume game. Rara Thomas might be back for this one. Don't care about that too much. Dylan Bell will probably get his weird 3-catch, 20 yards and a touchdown type game. But really, I'm focused on Carson Beck, Bowers, and McConkey. The fact that they sat those two in a game to end the season shows me that they are very focused on getting them heavily involved in the game plan for this one, and they're just better athletes than everybody on the field for Alabama, and that's saying something because Alabama has plenty of athletes in their own right. And Auburn, nobody expected Auburn to compete in that game to the degree that they did, and Jarvarius Johnson was just all over the place, making plays left and right, and getting wide open somehow. And if he can do that with Peyton Thorne throwing to him, then look out when it comes to Brock Powers and Ladd McConkey. So very involved, or very, very much interested in the Georgia passing game, and a moderate amount of interest in the running game too. With that, Kendrick Law bring back if we feel the need to do that. It's kind of the way that I'm playing this.
Yeah, and this Bama team just hasn't the same level of fear from a DFS perspective. We would just never target against them in the past, and I just don't feel that way about them. And yeah, with Bowers, assuming he's back, look out. You're right. He's going to have a big game. And that Auburn receiver room's actually got legit talent. They just unfortunately didn't have a very good quarterback there to throw them the ball. Do want to give you a shout out for Kendall Milton. You were kind of on him pre blowout. You started to notice a change there with his touches, and he's been really good since. 6.6 is a pretty nice price for him if you do want to go with the Georgia running back. I would prefer him myself just with the way he's been playing. And then to speak to Roydell Williams, if McClellan can't go, because I know 4K is a great price, and people are gonna be like, well, he hasn't really done much, and you're right, he hasn't. But the pedigree for this guy is pretty high. He's the number one player out of the state of Alabama, or he's number 4 player in the state of Alabama, top ranked running back, number 10 overall running back in his class, which was 2020. He had offers from Florida, Kentucky, Florida State, Auburn. This guy was the who's who of running backs coming out. It hasn't worked out quite well in the collegiate level, and that sometimes happens. But we're not talking about a guy who's a total scrub. If you took Roydell Williams off of Alabama and out of the SEC and plunked him in Tulane's offense, you're probably looking at a 1,200-yard rusher. So I do want to kind of say this guy's talented for sure. If you need a value at 4K, I think you can pay that price off there with 10 to 15 touches, regardless of the Georgia defense. So kind of my take on him there, but he's not a priority or anything like that. All right, moving on, we have the Fun Belt Championship between App State and Troy. Surprising there that the Dukes kind of faltered there towards the end. Starting with the App State guys, we had some really fun experiences with the Fun Belt teams this year. The JMU game in particular was tough from the Duke side, although some of the guys ended up working out. But Caden Robinson was somebody that I was hell-bent on having exposure to that week as the JMU defense wasn't great. And he ended up being 4% owned, and he absolutely obliterated 468 and 2 touchdowns. Followed that up last week with 108 and another 2 touchdowns, and he's actually now scored 6 touchdowns over his last 4 games. Price is only 5K. The Troy pass defense is one of the better units in the Sun Belt. But at this point, Robinson, that just seems way too cheap. Looking at, his target share, he has 71 targets on the season, 53 catches, 700 yards, 10 touchdowns. He has just been absolutely gold for them. And Aguilar is going to continue to look his way. Obviously, the defense is going to try to clamp down on him more, but they still have guys like Christian Horn, who's now apparently healthy, Deshaun Davis, who is pretty decent in his own right. Like, they can't just totally focus on him. They have other weapons in this passing game that are good, but Robinson stands out to me as a primary option in the receiving game for me to target for this slate. So I'm going back to him. I think we would see more ownership on him this time than we did last time they were on the slate, obviously, but I'm not going to let that push me away from a strong play. In the past, App State running backs, especially Nate Noel, have been fantastic, but this year they run 3, 4, sometimes 5 guys. The snaps are all pretty even amongst 3 of them, and it could be a game where Castle goes off, or Amani Marshall, who had been a good value on showdown slates a year ago, could potentially see a spike in work. So we're not really looking to the running backs of App State because of all those guys, getting touches. If Noel were to be ruled out after he, sat against the Georgia Southern game, like, that might make it a little interesting, but even then, there's still a ton of guys getting work. And I know Kanye Roberts rushed for 109 yards last week, but he still only had 14 carries because those other guys were stealing 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 carries. And he's 5'3". You're not getting a very big discount on Kanye, so I'm off of him there. I do like Aguilar as a super GPP play at 7K. He gets massive passing volume. He is liable to throw 350 yards, 3 to 4 touchdowns. He has some rushing upside. He's a really nice GPP look at 7K. Troy's defense is definitely a like I said, a unit that could contain or cause them to have some difficulties. But I do think Aguilar ends up throwing 30 plus passes here, and at 7K, if he connects on some of his big balls down the field there, or Robinson takes one for 60 plus, like, those fantasy points are going to add up really quick. So I just have a lot of faith in this App State passing game. I like them quite a bit. On the Troy side, you have our old friend Gunnar Watson at 6K, who I realize isn't a very exciting look by any means. But 6K is 6K, and he's another guy that's got pretty heavy passing volume here in this conference. 34 attempts, 31, 39, 27, and 40 over his last 5 games. And in that time, he's 392 yards, 271, 219, 199, and 289. Pretty solid numbers for a guy at 6K. And he's only had 1 game in his last 5 where he didn't throw for 3+ touchdowns. So he is just really, really looking good. App State is a team defensively that can get beaten, and they're giving up about 27 points per game, but the rushing defense is usually where they struggle. They're giving up 171 yards. They're better against the pass, but I just feel like there's another situation where there's going to be volume here for Watson. So you could use him at 6K for salary savings, and it's not the worst idea. Because of the rush defense of App State being horrific, Kamani Waddell makes all the sense in the world at 7K. He hasn't had the big spike games. Like earlier in the season, he had a 40 and a 45, but he's been pretty average since then. Way back in week 2, he was on the slate at 5'9". A lot of us used him. It was a down game. He had 17 carries for 83 yards, but he didn't find the end zone. So clearly it was a game that kind of left people with a bad taste in their mouth. But we're looking at a guy who's probably going to see 20, 25 touches at minimum. And that kind of volume for him against this defense should lead to at least 1 touchdown and probably 100+ yards. 7K is a little bit of a higher price for a running back that doesn't have maybe the upside of some others. But he's just going to get so much work. He's going to pound, and it's going to add up quickly. And then you have the cheap. So the Troy stack is cheap. You got Watson at 6K, and then you have all of his relevant receivers below 5K. So there's a nice little GPP stack here, possibly even in cash here if it goes the way I think. Jabre Barber leads the team in targets with 93, 61 catches, 841 yards, 5 touchdowns. Then you have Chris Lewis, 29 catches on 62 yards, 633 yards, and 9 touchdowns. He's been a bit of a deep ball threat, so he's going to, be that game breaker while Barber's going to rack up that PPR work. Then you have Devontae Ross, 56 targets, 37 catches, 425 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And then Deshaun Stoudemire, 53 targets, 38 catches, 500 yards, and a touchdown. I thought Stoudemire would have a little bit better of a season than he did, but these prices are way too cheap to ignore. Barber, especially at 4.4, stands out. Again, PPR galore. Like, I think this guy's almost a lock for 10 plus fantasy points. Could potentially, if he catches a touchdown or two, look at 20, 25. Like, he's just such a really strong play. And I have a tendency to go towards cheaper receivers anyway. We take our shots on some of these speculative values who may or may not pan out. I feel extremely confident that Barber will pan out. I think he'll probably see a decent chunk of ownership because of his price that just stands out. I suspect other publications and sites will be touting him as well. Chris Lewis, maybe a little bit of leverage there as a pivot off at 4.7 as the deep threat, but both are really good options. This game, as Sunbelt games tend to be, at least for me, is it got stack written all over it. You could easily run Waddell with the passing game on Appy State, or go the other way and play a heavy passing game of Troy, although I don't have any App State running backs I really want to use. But because of Aguiar and his tendency to contribute as a runner and as a passer, you could play him as well, possibly even running both quarterbacks. So for GBP, this is a game I want to stack a ton of. Total of 53.5. It's not the highest total in the world, but I do feel the over is in play, and it will be one of those ones that probably comes down to the last possession or two. So do not be afraid to get heavy exposure here throughout with all these cheap options if you want it. But I'm Barber, Robinson, and Vidal all the way. I'll decide if I want one of the cornerbacks, but Watson, like I said, isn't the worst play in the world. Might feel like one of those Max Johnson type plays that's cheap. It's going to North Carolina, by the way. But I think he's got the volume to pay that off. So do you like either of the quarterbacks in this one?
If it's one of the two, I'll probably lean Aguilar. Just have seen him have some success in similar spots and have seen him, be productive and be interesting. But I think probably mainly focused on the receivers on this one.
All right, we will move on. Louisville versus Florida State. It's a 1.5 point spread in favor of Florida State. A total of 47.5. Not having Jordan Travis is tough. A lot of people thinking some people saying crazy stuff. Well, they don't have Travis, they shouldn't be in the playoff. But if they win the game, they're entitled to that shot. So it's tough without him, though. And Louisville defense is tough. You mentioned weather might be in play here as well. This one could be a little bit on the ugly side potentially. What do you think?
So not only do they not have Jordan Travis, I've also started to see a little bit of smoke. They might not have Tate Rodemaker. There's some potential, there was talk of he came back in after a concussion on that pretty big hit that he took in the Florida game and hasn't really been right. Spread has kind of moved in the direction that would indicate something's not really, right, or maybe they just don't have a lot of faith in his ability to lead the team, even if he is available. But there has definitely been some rumor mill, and that would be really interesting because that would mean we would get a 5.3K Brock Glenn as the starting quarterback for Florida State, who would be in consideration. Anytime you're throwing to Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson, you got to throw Jaheim Bell in there too. But with those guys being your explosive options, I don't care who you are, you've got a chance to put up some pretty big numbers, especially against a defense that has been a little bit better stopping the run than the pass, and those guys are not priced highly. Coleman and Wilson at 5.2 and 4.9 is ridiculously low for both what we've seen pricing wise for them all season, and also for the context of this being such a meaningful game. It's not even if they have Rodemaker out there, it's not like we lost Jordan Travis and then like a high school quarterback is, a high school freshman is coming out. Like, this is still a college quarterback that got a scholarship to Florida State that's going to come out there and throw the ball to two of the more dynamic receivers in the country that should have all sorts of athletic advantages and be open. Like, I think we still have to consider that these are extremely talented and athletic receivers, even if it's not Jordan Travis. And whether it is Beck or Rodemaker, they're not going to run the ball as much as Jordan Travis did. So the receivers will probably get even more work because they're not just going to be able to run the quarterback and run Trey Benson, 25 times in this one. Not that we ever see Trey Benson himself run it 25 times. He hasn't been over 20 all season. He did do an extremely efficient job. 19 carries for 95 yards and 3 touchdowns against Florida. So I think, the obvious play, the play that most people will go to regardless of the quarterback scenario is going to be Trey Benson. And I do like that play. At 6'9", he's pretty expensive. And I think we're also going to see box stacked against him a good amount. Like, I think that there's not going to be a lot of respect for the passing game. And I think Mike Norvell knows that too. And so there'll be a concerted effort to everyone, says establish the run. I think there'll be a concerted effort to establish the pass in this one and make it so that, Louisville's not able to just throw 8 men in the box on every down and tie up Trey Benson that way, because they are going to have some balance. But that's the Florida State side of it. Obviously, need to watch that news, very TBD on, what that quarterback scenario is. I'm not super interested in using Rodemaker. However, if we do get back at 5'3", it's at least worthy of consideration. Obligatory mention of not using Jack Plummer. Don't use Jack Plummer. At running back, I'm loath to take a running back against Florida State the same way we would be against, a lot of defenses, but they have actually been attackable on the ground a little bit more than you would expect. Jawar Jordan, we think is the guy. Every time we think he's the guy, Garendo shows up, right? And we've seen some splitting of carries that's a little bit frustrating. And that's more palatable if those guys are both in like the high 5 to low 6K range. Jawar Jordan at 7-1, like, you kind of need him to be the guy, and you need him to get the end zone or the red zone work if we're paying that price tag. So I probably can't get there. If I am using a running back, I would prefer Garendo. But at the same time, he's not like a massive discount. He's not in the 4K range or even the low 5s. He's at 6'1", and that's a little bit too high too. So I probably don't want either of those guys. Yes, one of them probably will have a decent game. I'm not willing to pay to find out is where I'm sitting on that one. I would rather just use Benson on the other side, who I know is going to have the majority of the running back volume. But frankly, this isn't a game that I need a ton of pieces from. Thrash has been the guy in the past. Early on in the season, he was unstoppable against whatever defense, didn't matter, even put up a good game against Notre Dame. As of late, been a lot more, running game focused, and we haven't really seen Thrash do his thing to the same degree. And it's not like, there's been another receiver that has just taken over all of the volume and he's not getting there because of that. It's kind of just a little bit more spread out and a lot more heavily focused on the running game. And so that's a little disappointing for him, a guy that, we've looked to a number of times from DFS purposes and has a ton of talent and could very much, could show out, has the opportunity to show out here at 6'3". It's an okay price, a middling price. but add in weather and a tough defense, especially against the pass, a middling to poor quarterback and Plummer, and I think that the ground game will continue to be the focus in this one, as opposed to getting away from trend, which I think most teams will do. A lot of signs point to Louisville focusing on the ground game and continuing to do that. So I'm off Thrash as well. If you want to throw Jordan or Guerrero in a GPP lineup, I'm totally okay with that, but they're not going to be priorities for me in this one. Whereas, a 5-2 Keon Coleman, I have to consider, even with a backup quarterback in there, and same with a 4-9 Johnny Wilson.
Definitely. I will throw a name for GBPs out in Joey Gatewood. It delights me to see that he's been fairly productive over the last 3 games, playing tight end.
I had a feeling you might have brought him up. I'm glad I omitted that so we could have you bring him up.
I was giddy when he scored a touchdown against Virginia. I was like, Gatewood scored, all right, because he's been around and tried to play multiple positions, but 8 targets in the last 3 games. Weather potential, obviously Plummer's not great. The pass defense will probably not get beat with anything deep. Like Gatewood, a couple of short, passes. Maybe they get into the red zone, touchdown, 3-4. So the GPP shot at Gatewood. I had to throw that out there. But yeah, man, the Coleman price at 5. I mean, and obviously Wilson at 4.9 too, but the Coleman price at 5.2, like I'm just so much more excited about him. But I mean, equally, both guys are so good, but damn, Coleman at 5.2 is just like the dream price for him. It could go real bad, obviously, but the upside there, I think, is too good to pass up. Regardless of who's at quarterback, it'd be better, I think, for Rodemaker, just because he at least has a little experience there. He won't be completely overwhelmed by the moment. But geez, it's going to be a real tough decision to not use one of Wilson or Coleman there at those prices, because that's just wild. All right, we finish up the slate with Michigan versus Iowa. It's a tough spot to really get excited about. Iowa side of it, they're in a dome, but quarterback, we've got a near min price, 5.5, cheap for Deacon Hill, but obviously we're not using him. He's been getting volume, but completing a very low percentage. Usually when we look at Iowa, we're looking at one of LaShawn Williams, who did rush for 111 yards against Nebraska, or Caleb Johnson, who was a guy that we really, coming into the season felt pretty good about. The Utah State game starting out was like it should have been a big spot, but he really kind of underperformed with 19 carries. He had the one big game against Purdue, but he's not been exciting. Not looking at him. Wide receivers, they're all their relevant, best guys and tight ends, and everyone has just been hurt. All of these guys are near min price. Really the only one to maybe look at if you're like, I got to play an Iowa person. I gotta have somebody from Iowa in one of my lineups just to feel alive. It's probably Nico Regani at 3.2, but again, really not great. Harbaugh's having pressers where he's just like, they're not going to beat us. Like, and you're probably right. So it's hard to get excited about any of them. Defensively, they're legit. Obviously, that's Iowa. Like if they can score 1 to 2 touchdowns, their defense usually keeps them around. But this Michigan team, it's going to be tough to keep them under. 8.3 JJ McCarthy's an easy fade for me against any opponent, let alone Iowa. Really hurts the receivers. Roman Wilson, is just a touchdown machine, has been all year, is 11 total, has cooled off recently, but at 6K, he's got upside there to at least find the end zone. My man, the tight end, Colston Loveland at 4.4, he's been getting that PPR work in, 5 for 88 last week against Ohio State. Pretty impressed there. When McCarthy does pass, a lot of that success that's not a touchdown to Roman Wilson does end up being short yardage stuff to Loveland, so he racks up, targets and work there. We did see, we had that shout a couple weeks ago from our guest there about Samaj Morgan against Maryland. He did score a rushing touchdown for what it's worth, but not a lot to like there. If you're using anyone in this game, it's got to be a Michigan running back, and it's probably not Donovan Edwards as much as I really want it to be. 10-plus carries in 3 straight games, by the way. It's not materializing. It's not working out for Edwards. It's been a disaster of a season for sure. It's Blake Corum if you want to use anyone, and he's 8'2", and there's not a very efficient level with his running this season. He has 202 carries, but he still hasn't hit 1,000 yards. YPC of about 4.8. We're seeing a ton of 28 carries for 90 yards, 24 carries for 80 yards. One thing he's doing, though, is scoring, and he's just finding the end zone so much. He has 22 touchdowns, and that makes him a great play on FanDuel. It's a little tougher on DraftKings because, he's got games where he's scoring 3 touchdowns, but he only had 25 fantasy points. And that's a decent chunk, yes, but you would expect the guy that scores 3 times to be giving you 35 to 40. And I'm being a little greedy there, but that's just the reality of the situation. Very high floor. Touches are safe. When they get anywhere close to the red zone goal line, Corum's going to get it. Like Edwards he's not getting it. Edwards does get some goal line carries, but he gets stuffed or he tries to do this little sidestep thing and it just doesn't work. They give it to Corum and he just puts his head down and barrels over the defense. So you have multi-touchdown upside with Blake Corum. He's really the only possible play in your main lineup in this entire game. Ownership wise, I think that price maybe keeps it down below 30%. But if you've been kind of, getting burnt the last few weeks, or you want a level of safety in your lineup, you do want to go ahead and pay up for Blake Corum just to get that, guaranteed 20-25 and hope that he can break 100 yards here to get you that rest of that upside. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to go there. It's there's a myriad of options. I'd probably rather play Ashton Genty from Boise State, but I think Corum definitely makes sense in this particular game. And that wraps up the slate, unless you want to hop in with any secret Iowa plays. I know you probably have at least one, but if not, we'll move to the next section here.
No Iowa plays, but I did want to just mention that Michigan brought out an Alex Orgy package for the Ohio State game. So think doing Taysom Hill things, right? And so if they're doing that against Ohio State and willing to show that, they may also be willing to show that, down around the goal line. And so that takes not that there's a ton of luster to Corum to begin with, but takes even a little bit more luster if there's the possibility of them doing weird alternate quarterback goal line run type stuff. And that takes away the one thing that does give Corum some upside is his proclivity around the goal line.
Yeah, and I'm just so disappointed in Michigan's run game. I had Penn State and Michigan were 2 teams coming in. I was like, man, these running backs are going to just be so nasty, and it just hasn't happened. Corum scoring touchdowns, but
except against Michigan State, they all did pretty well against Michigan State.
Sure, but I was expecting like game after game of that, man. Just so disappointed. All right, let's get we'll kind of barrel through the last few things here. What's the core you're looking at here for this 8-game slate?
So I think we are going to go with Finn at quarterback. We are going to go with Baxter at running back, and we are going to go with Bowers at wide receiver. And that is probably pretty chalky.
So for me, there's so many cheap quarterbacks. I love Finn. I'll probably have plenty of Finn, but I think at this moment the number one quarterback for me is Jaden Mavia from UNLV at 6'8". I do think he'll be popular, so not super exciting, which means the core receiver for me is going to be near the top with Ricky White at 6'7". That pairing just makes way too much sense. And then at running back, I've been the 4 running back king the last month and a half of the season. I've been all about it, but I am going to be coring once again Mekhi Hughes sitting there at 6'4" for Tulane, just because the volume is going to be there, but also very high on Kamani Waddell. All right, PrizePicks, and then we'll have a couple props, get your slate breakers, and then we'll be out of here. There are a lot of interesting PrizePicks props here. I like this passing plus rushing yards. It's been something that I've kind of been all over this season and kind of going in line with my core QB, Jaden Mavia. 271.5 passing plus rushing yards. I like his over here against Boise State. Just feel like he's going to have himself a really strong game. So I'm sitting there with him. And then Rome Odunze for my Huskies. They got his fantasy total at 20. He's going to have 30. So I'm hitting the over 20 fantasy points there. What are some of yours?
I'm gonna hit Chris Brazell over 3.5 catches. He's been pretty much the only guy involved for that passing offense, and everybody else is hurt. And so I think there's going to be, even if with it being a Mekhi Hughes game, I think there's plenty of opportunity for him to catch 4 balls. I'm gonna go under 103.5 rushing yards for Ollie Gordon. It's a dangerous game, but if we're fading him in DFS, we got to, fully commit to that conviction, right? So under 103.5 rushing yards for Ollie Gordon, and then hop on over to the fantasy score. I'm going to go over 14.5 for Brock Bowers, and then over 10.5 for Keon Coleman. I think, Keon Coleman can catch 5 balls for 60 yards. I think that's doable.
Yeah, Coleman, there's so many things to like with that price and some of these props. And I even went, when I'm looking at the DK props, went to look at this because, there's some uncertainty here, and we might get even better number depending on what happens with the Rotobaker news. But anytime touchdown score for Keon Coleman at plus 120. It's not super glamorous. Again, we're never going to get the plus 400 like we had early in the season, but I like his chances of finding the end zone here, title game, and they're going to have to look his way, and they're going to have to get him a lot of work. So I like his anytime touchdown prop there. And then the rushing, CJ Baxter minus 115, assuming he's healthy, good to go there. They have his rushing yards at 92.5. I just if he's full go, there's 100 plus rushing yards there pretty easily, I think, against the Oklahoma State defense. I wouldn't foresee any trouble there at all. And then we do have a lower number for Ashton Genty, 76.5 rushing yards. We know Holani's going to be in the mix there, going to take some work, but I think this is a game where we're going to see a lot of fantasy goodness. So I'm taking his over 76.5 rushing yards there as well. All right, that brings us to the end here. Let's get a slate breaker from you to close it out.
So I'll actually give you 2, one for the Friday slate and one for the all day Saturday slate. So I guess it's tough to break a 2-game slate. Like there's such condensed ownership, and not surprising anybody with this pick, but I'm going to go with Quentin Cooley, 18 carries, 165 yards and 2 touchdowns for Quentin Cooley at 6'3". So that's that's a little bit off brand, but it's tough to get too far off the radar on a 2-gamer. For the Saturday slate, let's go with DeQuan Finn, 200 yards, 225 yards passing, and a touchdown, as well as 100 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns on the ground for DeQuan Finn.
Hell yeah. And I have one with Caden Robinson. I think he catches 10 passes, 2 touchdowns, and 150 yards in what turns out to be one of the best games of the day for the Sun Belt Championship. That will wrap it up. We appreciate everyone's continued support throughout the season. It has been really, really fun. We'll be taking a little bit of a hiatus for the shows on the CFB side next week because of the Army Navy, but we will be back. There is a big projected slate on December 16th, which is a Saturday. I believe there'll be 6 to 7 bowl games that day. So we'll be back the week after for a show breaking that one down. And then, of course, there'll be a ton of bowl coverage. Thank you, everyone. Again, thanks to Jake for hanging in there throughout the season. A lot of good info. It has been a blast. And we will see you guys next time on the CFB Super Show. Saturday morning, we'll be back and in the Discord grinding, getting those green screens and lots of trips to the window. We're out.